Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when dinner rarely involved anything exciting. Refrigeration didn't exist, and the average person considered 2 onions and a spoonful of hope a fairly decent meal. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe take a slow breath, because we're easing gently into the world of medieval food. Not the royal feast, so, no. Those were loud, dramatic, and full of questionable meats. We're going somewhere quieter, simpler, rougher. We're going to eat like a medieval peasant. Don't worry, you don't actually have to taste anything. The imagination is enough, especially because most medieval peasant foods were texturally challenging and visually indistinct. The sort of thing that made you look at your bowl and think, well, it's warm at least, so let's drift into it. Life for a medieval peasant followed a certain rhythm. A rhythm that began far too early in the morning and ended far too late at night. And through those long hours, everything depended on energy. That meant food. But food meant farming. And farming meant sun, exhaustion, and the sort of back pain that modern chiropractors only dream of. Peasants didn't have time for complicated meals. They didn't have ingredients for complicated meals. And even if they did, their kitchens, or what passed for kitchens, were not exactly inspiring. Imagine a dark corner of a one-room house, next to the family goat, with a single iron pot that had been burned so many times it was essentially a charcoal sculpture. That was the kitchen. And in that pot lived the most important dish of the medieval world, pottage. If you're unfamiliar with pottage, imagine a stew. Now imagine removing all the good parts of stew. Remove the meat, remove the flavor, remove anything that could be described with the word chunk. What you have left is pottage, or warm, watery slurry of grains, and whatever plants were nearby and not actively poisonous. But to the medieval peasant, this was life. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, day after day, week after week. By the time someone reached adulthood, their bloodstream was probably 40% barley mush. You might think that sounds bleak, and yes it was. But don't worry, there was variety. Sort of. Some days, the pottage contained beans. Other days, it contained peas. On rare and exciting days, someone might have found a carrot. Not a modern carrot, by the way. Medieval carrots were pale, wiry, and shaped like something that had seen things. But it was still a vegetable, and that counted. On even rarer days, usually holidays, there might be meat, a bit of bacon, a scrap of salted pork, a piece of fish that looked more skeleton than substance. Meat was a luxury, and peasants treated it the way we treat gold-plated headphones, something they technically owned, but never actually used. And speaking of fish, you might be imagining something fresh and pleasant, perhaps caught gently from a sparkling river. No, medieval preserved fish tasted like it had already lived a full life, retired, and then been pressed into service again. But it was protein, and protein was energy, and energy was how you survived the week. Now, let's drift over to the next essential staple of medieval peasant cuisine: bread. Not the warm bakery bread you know today. Medieval peasant bread was hard, really hard. So hard that some surviving loaves found by archaeologists look like they could double as defensive weapons. Wheat bread was rare and reserved for the upper classes, who of course wasted it by eating it while complaining about something else. Peasants ate rye, they ate barley, they ate oats. Occasionally, they ate bread that contained all three and a few stray pieces of straw, not by choice, but because medieval flour milling was less precise art and more some guy shaking a sieve and hoping for the best. On the bright side, the rough texture did wonders for dental health. And by wonders, I mean that most peasants lost half their teeth by age 30 because the bread worked like edible sandpaper. Still, bread mattered. You could dip it in pottage. You could carry it in your pocket. You could drop it on the floor and not notice any difference in consistency. A good, sturdy loaf could last weeks, mostly because bacteria looked at it and said, no thanks. If someone had a bit of land, and by bit, I mean a sad rectangle of earth, with opinions, they might grow vegetables. Medieval vegetables were not the vegetables we know today. Modern breeds have been carefully cultivated, optimized, sweetened, and conveniently shaped. Medieval vegetables, meanwhile, were more honest. And by honest, I mean aggressively ugly. Turnips were common. They tasted like disappointment. Cabbages appeared frequently. They smelled like decisions you regretted immediately. Leeks were everywhere, because they grew even when absolutely nothing else wanted to. Peasants didn't choose vegetables, they accepted whatever stubborn green survivors happened to force themselves out of the soil, and nothing went to waste. Not the leaves, not the roots, not the bits that modern people would throw away out of principle. Everything went into the pot. If it grew, it stewed. Now, you might be wondering about milk, and yes, milk existed, but cows were valuable. Selling milk made money, drinking milk did not. So peasants mostly consumed milk after it turned into something else. Soft cheese, hard cheese, sour cheese. That wasn't entirely sure what category it belonged to. Medieval cheese was a gamble, but one peasants were willing to take, because calcium was better than starvation. Butter was even rarer, and usually saved for special occasions. If a medieval peasant had butter, you knew something important had happened, like a wedding, a festival, or a miracle. Let's drift over to drinks. You probably know that medieval water quality was not ideal, not catastrophic. Necessarily streams existed, but it wasn't always safe. So peasants drank ale, weak ale, very weak ale, the kind of ale that was about as alcoholic as sadness, but it was safer than water, and it kept people hydrated. Children drank it, elders drank it, everyone drank it. Wine existed, but mostly for monks and nobles. Cider appeared occasionally in certain regions when apples behaved themselves. Mead existed, but cost too much, because bees have always charged premium rates. So ale it was, all day, every day. And if you're imagining a pleasantly tipsy village atmosphere, no, weak ale was basically malty water. No one was having fun. Now let's talk about something peasants rarely saw but deeply appreciated from a distance. Spices. Nobles used spices like Instagram influencers use filters excessively and without restraint. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper, all the fragrant luxuries. Meanwhile, the average peasant seasoned their food with whatever herbs happened to be growing near their house. Maybe parsley, maybe dill, sometimes wild garlic, sometimes something that looked like wild garlic but later turned out to be a plant that made them see colors. But overall, seasoning was mild, gentle, barely noticeable, which matched the general vibe of survival-oriented cooking. Still, meals were social. Even simple food tasted better when accompanied by family, neighbors, and whoever was passing by and looked vaguely hungry. People dipped bread into the communal pot. They shared bowls. They talked about the weather. They talked about crop failures. They talked about taxes, usually in a tone that suggested the crown had once again made decisions from the comfort of not living in reality. Evening meals were calmer, softer. After a long day in the fields, a warm bowl of pottage in front of a fire, however small, was comforting. Not fancy, not exciting, but grounding. A reminder that life continued, one spoon at a time. And that brings us to something easily overlooked. Medieval peasants didn't expect luxury. They weren't dreaming of feasts. They weren't waiting for gourmet flavors. They had work to do, families to support, and aches to ignore. Food was fuel. Quiet, humble fuel, enough to get through another day, enough to live. Now, of course, we can drift gently toward the seasons, because medieval eating changed with the calendar, sometimes dramatically. Spring meant fresh greens, nettles, sorrel, new shoots, the sort of things modern people call foraged, which sounds charming until you're doing it because there is literally nothing else. Summer brought abundance berries, leafy vegetables, fresh eggs, maybe even a surplus of milk. The only problem was spoiling. Everything spoiled. Rapidly, summer warmth was not kind to medieval storage techniques. Autumn meant harvesting. Busy days, hard work. Also one of the few times of year peasants might actually eat meat, for preserving rather than pleasure. Anything that could be salted, smoked, pickled, or dried was processed without hesitation. And then came winter, the season that made or broke households. Food was rationed. Meals became thinner. Pottage stretched into dimensions never intended for human consumption. If you had a carrot in January, you were considered blessed. If you had a cabbage in February, you were practically royalty. Winter meals were dark, quiet, and repetitive, but they were still meals, and that mattered. Let's drift into the topic of feast days. Medieval peasants adored feast days, not because they were extravagant, but because they offered small breaks in monotony. The church calendar provided dozens of opportunities for slightly better food, a bit of meat, a bit of cheese, maybe a small pie. Perhaps honey if someone in the village had annoyed fewer bees than usual that year. Easter and Christmas were the biggest culinary events, not noble banquets, but communal meals where everyone contributed something: a chicken, a loaf of better bread, a jug of stronger ale, enough to feel festive without being luxurious. And yes, peasants could occasionally attend a noble feast, usually as servants, silently delivering trays of roasted animals and dishes covered in spices worth more than their homes. They might sneak a taste, they might not, but watching a noble eat was enough to reinforce the great lesson of medieval dining. If you wanted flavorful food, you should have chosen wealthier parents. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about medieval peasant eating habits was that they worked. Not well, and not pleasantly, but they worked. Peasants survived. They endured backbreaking work on diets we would consider deeply insufficient. They lived on grains, beans, cabbage, and determination. Their bodies were lean. Their lives were short, their meals were simple, and in that simplicity there was a certain quietness, a rhythm, a softness that fits well into a bedtime monologue. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just life. Ordinary, patient, persistent life. And with that, we can let the pot simmer a little longer, because in our next part, we'll drift into another strange, sleepy corner of the past, where human stubbornness meets historical oddity. But for now, that's how to eat like a medieval peasant. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's settle in again. Maybe loosen your shoulders a little. Let the room get dim. The way history always feels soft around the edges and gently judgmental. Tonight, we re-gliding from the humble pottage pot straight into the dining halls of Europe's royal families. Not for the food, but for the genetics, which were, unfortunately, cooked far less successfully. Because if medieval peasants ate the same thing every day, European royals married the same people every generation, usually their cousins, sometimes their nieces, occasionally someone who looked suspiciously like a sibling, but technically wasn't, according to a royal advisor who definitely squinted too hard when he said it. This was dynastic strategy, it was political calculus, and it was also, medically speaking, a slow, centuries-long experiment in what happens when you keep stirring the same gene pool without ever adding fresh water. Spoiler: the results were noticeable. So let's drift gently into the candlelit chaos of royal inbreeding. Nothing too dramatic, nothing too loud. Just a calm little stroll through the family trees that looked less like trees and more like circles. Let's begin with a familiar name: Charles II of Spain. A man often referred to, rather tragically, as the Bewitched. Not because he was magical, but because no one could figure out how one human could contain so many medical problems at once without spontaneously evaporating. Charles was the final product of 2 centuries of Habsburg. His family's favorite wedding venue was the nearest cousin's house. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also uncle and niece. Many of his ancestors were double first cousins, which is a phrase that should never apply to more than one generation, let alone 5. The result was Charles II, a king whose jaw was so pronounced it could have been classified as a geological formation. He struggled to chew, which, given the Habsburg love of elaborate meats, was an unfortunate design flaw. He learned to speak very late. He walked late. He matured late. One tutor described him as gentle, which is usually code for, "I don't want to get fired for telling the truth." His enormous Habsburg chin, combined with his fragile health, made him resemble a noble turnip that had been dropped a few too many times. And yet, he ruled the most powerful empire in Europe, because dynastic logic didn't care about biology, it cared about bloodlines, preferably bloodlines that looped around like a confused snake. Charles spent his life plagued by illness. He suffered seizures, chronic infections, digestive issues. He struggled with fertility, and surprisingly, since most of that responsibility had been genotyped out generations earlier, physicians tried everything to help him. Everything except the one useful treatment, which would have involved sending the Habsburgs outside to marry literally anyone else. But no, tradition was tradition, and naturally, they made it worse. Let's drift next to Joanna of Castile, better known somewhat unfairly as Joanna the Mad. Joanna came from a famous family that collected tragedies the way modern people collect unopened emails. Her mother, Isabella, was brilliant and formidable. Her father, Ferdinand, spent most of his time plotting, strategizing, and admiring his own political moves. Their marriage was political genius, but genetically, the Trastamarras had already accumulated a suspicious number of shared ancestors. Joanna, unfortunately, inherited the family mental instability. It wasn't caused only by inbreeding stress, trauma, and a deeply unhelpful husband contributed quite generously, but the genetic load certainly didn't help. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, was indeed handsome, the sort of handsome that caused problems, as handsomeness often does. He had the emotional maturity of a decorative vase and the fidelity of a traveling bard. Joanna adored him. Philip adored everyone else. When he died suddenly, Joanna's breakdown became legendary. She reportedly refused to bury his body. She traveled with the coffin. She opened it repeatedly just to check he was still there. Which, yes, he was, though looking progressively worse each time. Was she mad? Partially. Was she mistreated? Entirely. Was inbreeding part of the equation? Absolutely. The royal families of Iberia had been marrying cousins like it was a competitive sport for generations, and the results were psychological instability, emotional volatility, and a royal court that considered mental health care to mean locking someone in a tower and hoping for the best. Now, let's drift quietly over to the Ptolemies of Egypt, because if anyone understood the phrase, keeping it in the family, it was them. The Ptolemies didn't just marry cousins, they married siblings, full siblings, consistently, repeatedly, without hesitation or discomfort. Their family tree genuinely looked like someone had scribbled circles on a papyrus scroll and called it a day. And into this genetic whirlpool walked Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra, the last and most famous of the line. Cleopatra was brilliant, charismatic, multilingual, politically adept. She kept Rome on its toes for years, but genetically, she came from a dynasty that treated sibling marriage as an everyday, perfectly reasonable habit, like brushing teeth or ignoring taxes. Cleopatra herself did not marry her brothers out of romance. She did it out of dynastic pressure. Her brother husbands were usually 12 years old, or actively plotting against her, sometimes both. Cleopatra had to outmaneuver them for control, which she did, mostly by being significantly more competent than the rest of her family combined. But even she couldn't escape the long-term effects of Ptolemaic inbreeding. The dynasty that began with Alexander the Great's generals and grand ambitions eventually collapsed into fragile heirs, unstable rulers, and the occasional pharaoh who seemed confused by basic reality. Cleopatra was the last burst of brilliance in a line that had been genetically recycling itself for centuries. Let's drift over to the Habsburgs again, because they were truly committed to the theme. Another notable product of this genetic experiment was Maria Anna of Spain, aunt of Charles II. She married her cousin, Ferdinand III. Her parents were also cousins. Her grandparents were also cousins. You begin to sense a pattern. Maria Anna possessed what diplomats politely described as the full Habsburg profile: strong chin, large lower lip, eyes slightly misaligned, as if unsure whether they wanted to participate. Her health was fragile. Her pregnancies difficult. Her children, unsurprisingly, inherited varying degrees of Habsburg traits, including the jaw that could be seen from multiple angles at once. The dynasty simply could not stop itself. Cousin after cousin, uncle after niece, nephew after aunt. By the time Charles II died, geneticists estimate his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings, which, if nothing else, is an impressive if unfortunate statistical achievement. Now, drifting softly northward, we arrive in Scandinavia. The royal families there were not as thoroughly interwoven as the Habsburgs, but they had their moments. Take King Christian VII of Denmark, a fragile young man born into a line with enough shared DNA to cause concern. He suffered from severe mental illness. Today, he'd receive treatment, therapy, and support. In the 18th century, however, treatment consisted mostly of ignoring him and hoping he didn't do anything too destructive. He developed tics, paranoia, delusions, and a deep fear of being touched. He also enjoyed running through palace hallways shouting nonsense, which, while not ideal for governance, at least added variety to court life. His marriage to Caroline Matilda, sister of George III, was predictably disastrous. Christian had little interest in her, or in governing, or in sanity. She eventually began an affair with the royal physicianer, man who had the extremely poor judgment to both improve Christian's mental health and also romance his wife. Naturally, this did not end well, and the underlying instability, partly environmental, partly emotional, partly inherited, and partly due to a family tree with more loops than branches, Next, with a slow drift, we stop in Portugal, where King Afonso VI reigned briefly and chaotically. Afonso was physically and mentally disabled from a young age. He could barely walk, had poor coordination, and regularly flew into rages. His brother eventually replaced him with minimal difficulty. Some of Afonso's impairments likely came from early illness, but the House of Braganza was also rather fond of cousin marriages, which never helped. Afonso's marriage was annulled on the grounds that it had never been consummated. His wife married his brother instead, which is, yes, that is peak royal family energy. Let's drift finally into the quiet, marshy lands of the Slavic kingdoms, where the Jagiellonian dynasty demonstrates one of the more subtle results of inbreeding, infertility. For several generations, they struggled to produce heirs. Marriages between cousins and second cousins meant that each generation carried a heavier genetic burden. 5 royal sons died young. Daughters miscarried or failed to conceive. The line eventually collapsed, not with madness or deformity, but with silence. Sometimes the most powerful dynasty falls not with a war, but with a missing heir. There's something oddly calming about royal inbreeding, not the suffering of course, but the inevitability. The slow, predictable unraveling of dynasties that believed they could outsmart nature. They wanted pure bloodlines, unbroken houses, eternal continuity. What they got instead were fragile heirs, sickly kings, unstable queens, dynastic drama that reads like a medical warning label, centuries of power, gently undone by their own insistence on never marrying anyone new. It's a reminder that history is less about grand battles and more about small choices repeated far too many times. Hey everyone, let's settle back in. Maybe let the air get a little heavier and the world a little quieter. Because tonight, we're drifting into the royal nurseries of the medieval world. They sound charming, of course, silk cradles, embroidered linens, candlelit lullabies. But behind all that soft imagery were some of the strangest, saddest, and often unintentionally comedic childhoods in European history. Royal children didn't grow up the way modern children do. There were no playgrounds, no freedom, no affection unless a tutor approved it. Their toys were often symbolic objects meant to prepare them for kingship, which is another way of saying they were handed a miniature sword at age 3 and told to practice being intimidating. But mostly, royal children were fragile, physically fragile, emotionally fragile, spiritually fragile, and occasionally fragile in ways that made doctors squint and say, well, that's new. Let's drift gently into the cradle. We can start with something simple. Medieval royals were born to die, not intentionally of course. Their parents did want them alive. They just had an impressive ability to produce heirs with immune systems that behaved like shy woodland creatures, too delicate for the real world, too overwhelmed by everything. A slight breeze, a mild chill, a particularly judgmental-looking priest. The average royal child's life expectancy was brutally low. Even when born into palaces with servants, gold, and enough tapestries to carpet a small country, they were still vulnerable to, well, everything. Teething could turn fatal. Colds could become lifelong health issues. And measles swept through royal nurseries with the enthusiasm of a tax collector discovering a new village. If you've ever wondered why kingdoms had succession crises every other decade, the answer is simple. Half their heirs evaporated before the age of 10. Let's drift toward one of the most famous, sickly, royal children, Henry VI of England. Henry was the kind of child who looked like he needed a nap from the moment he was born. A quiet boy with an extremely gentle personality. He ascended the throne at 9 months old in age, where most children are still trying to figure out what their own feet are for. Henry's childhood was spent surrounded by guardians who argued over everything, including who got to hold him, who got to teach him, and who got to make decisions in his name. He grew up timid, soft-spoken, nervous, and fundamentally unprepared for the political chaos that would later unfold into the Wars of the Roses. As an adult, Henry suffered mental breakdowns so severe he once sat motionless for over a year. He didn't speak, didn't respond, didn't blink much. He simply rested, aggressively, with regal commitment. Looking at his childhood, you almost can't blame him. The poor man never stood a chance. Moving gently across the channel, we find another example. Louis the Dauphin, son of Louis XV of France. Louis was sick from birth, pale, frail, the sort of child physicians poked with concern. He caught every disease available. smallpox twice, measles, scarlet fever, tuberculosis. He also had mysterious fevers that made doctors shrug, sigh, and recommend prayer. He lived long enough to produce children, including the future Louis XVI, who would later lose his head in a more literal way. Louis himself died young. His siblings didn't fare much better. Of 10 children born, only a few survived adulthood. Royal families built empires, they commanded armies, they shaped politics, and yet they couldn't win a battle against the average medieval microbe. Let's drift over to Iberia again, where the royal nurseries were filled with small, pale children named Juan, Isabella, Maria, another Juan, and another Marietha. Naming creativity was low, but the mortality rate was high. Perhaps the most tragic was Prince Juan, son of Isabella and Ferdinand, the golden heir of Spain. He was intelligent, promising, adored, and unfortunately possessed the physical resilience of a damp bread roll. His parents adored him, Spain adored him, the church adored him, and then Juan married, and promptly died at 19, probably from overexerting himself during the wedding celebrations, a cause of death that historians try to politely gloss over, but which roughly translates to too much honeymoon enthusiasm, which was historically common among fragile young nobles. The entire Spanish succession spiraled into chaos because one teenager had the immune system of a decorative feather. Now, let's quietly drift north again, to Scotland, where James V spent his childhood in a situation best described as educational trauma. James became king at just 17 months old. His father died in battle, leaving a baby on the throne, a baby whose main interests at the time included being fed and occasionally seeing a bright color. Naturally, the nobles immediately began fighting for control of him. They argued over custody, over who got to supervise his lessons, over who should stand closest during ceremonies. James grew up surrounded by adults whose main hobby was political stabbing, literal or otherwise. By the time he reached adulthood, he was anxious, suspicious, and deeply fond of revenge, which makes sense. His childhood had essentially been one long custody battle with swords. Sliding eastward, we find Ivan, the terrible child whose early years make his adult behavior tragically comprehensible. Ivan's parents died when he was young. His caretakers ignored him. The nobles beat him, starved him, and neglected him while they fought over influence. Ivan often roamed the palace in tattered clothes, scavenging for food, while boyars stepped around him as if he were an inconvenient rug. He grew up emotionally warped, angry, and paranoid. By age 13, he responded to his childhood trauma by throwing a noble out a window, which, while not ideal, was emotionally speaking pretty on brand. A sickly, neglected child became a ruthless ruler, and historians spent centuries trying to pretend this was surprising. Now, let's drift into the French court again, where royal children were raised in ways that were simultaneously luxurious and extremely strange. Take Louis XIV, the Sun King. As a child, Louis suffered smallpox and nearly died. He also endured the Fronde rebellions that forced him to flee Paris in the middle of the night. At one point, he hid in a cold, damp room while armed mobs rampaged nearby. Louis XIV grew up needing warmth, attention, and order. So naturally, he built Versailles Palace that radiated heat, glitter, and an army of servants to follow him around like decorative shadows. Trauma can be very architectural. His younger brother, Philippe, had a different kind of childhood. Their mother wanted Louis to stay powerful, so she discouraged Philippe from showing leadership. She dressed him in girls' clothing, adorned him with ribbons, told him repeatedly that ambition was unbecoming. Philippe grew up flamboyant, dramatic, and uninterested in ruling. Instead, he became Europe's most magnificent royal gossip machine. His childhood had successfully shaped him, but not quite in the way the family expected. Let's drift now to the world of overly protected royal children. The ones who were smothered with affection, surveillance, and tutors who followed them around like worried geese. One such child was Edward VI of England, son of Henry VIII. Edward was raised like a precious glass bauble handled delicately, watched constantly, and kept far from any possible threat, including fresh air and common sense. He studied for hours each day, languages, scripture, philosophy, government, enough information to make a grown adult need a nap. His tutors praised him endlessly, calling him brilliant, angelic, and destined for greatness. But Edward's body wasn't built for the job. He was thin, pallid, and prone to chest infections. He died at 15, leaving England in the hands of increasingly desperate relatives who tried to install Lady Jane Grey as Queen. A 9-day disaster that was somehow still more stable than Edward's lungs. Let's drift toward another fragile heir, Charles IX of France. Charles was anxious from birth, pale, weak, prone to shaking. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, controlled every aspect of his life with the intensity of a stage manager raising a porcelain doll. He tried to be king. He really did, but stress turned him into a trembling, sickly young man who believed he was being haunted by the ghosts of people he had ordered murdered during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. He bled from his pores. He hallucinated. He coughed blood. He died at 23, apologizing to his mother for not being stronger. His childhood of pressure, guilt, and frailty had prepared him only for tragedy. And then we have "Don't touch me, children," a surprisingly common type in royal households. For example, Philip I of France, who refused to bathe because water made him uncomfortable, or Prince John of the UK, the epileptic youngest son of George V, who spent his childhood isolated in a remote cottage so the public wouldn't see him, or the numerous Habsburg children who entered life already exhausted, as if centuries of cousin marriages had handed them a genetic instruction manual labeled "good luck." But perhaps the saddest part of royal childhoods is something simple. They were never allowed to be children. They were heirs, assets, symbols. They were future treaties, future alliances, future political tools. They were taught etiquette before they learned to walk. They learned to bow before they learned to run. They met ambassadors before they met friends. And whether they were sickly, spoiled, lonely, or simply confused, their childhoods were quiet tragedies wrapped in velvet and gold. No wonder so many of them grew up strange, or sad, or unstable, or aggressively attached to power because it was the only thing they were ever allowed to hold. Royal childhood was not magical. It was claustrophobic, a cradle lined with silk but filled with expectations heavy enough to crush anyone. Hey everyone, settle back in. Take a slow breath. Tonight, we're drifting from the muddy kitchens of medieval peasants to something far more velvet-lined and politically complicated. Because, of course, history never gives us a simple upgrade. When you move from porridge to palaces, you also move from hunger to paranoia, from smoke-blackened huts to rooms filled with silk, scheming, and the soft rustle of someone plotting your downfall behind a beaded curtain. So, let's drift into that world. A world Marco Polo claimed calmly, confidently, and perhaps a little too eagerly to have witnessed up close. Whether or not he actually did, we'll let his storytelling speak for itself. Just sink into the cushions, dim the lights, and let's wander into Marco Polo's secret notes on the harem, or at least the notes he swore he gathered while traveling through the Mongol Empire, the Yuan court, and any palace that would let him look inside for more than 2 seconds. He was, after all, a Venetian merchant, which means he had precisely the level of discretion you'd expect from someone who grew up in a city where gossip is practically a maritime industry. We begin with Marco as a young man. He was soft around the edges. Not unfit, just shaped like someone who's eaten a little too much good Venetian seafood and hasn't yet learned that horses in Mongolia do not slow down for curious foreigners. His father and uncle dragged him across the Silk Road, introducing him to a world of deserts, spices, and rulers whose daily routines made European kings look like budgeteer landlords. And somewhere along the way, he discovered the Mongol court. Now, the Mongols did many things fiercely, efficiently, and with admirable minimalism. But when it came to harems, they did not go small. They did not think modestly. They did not believe in restraint. Marco wrote about harems the way a man writes when he knows no one back home will ever be able to fact-check him. Venice was very far away. Wikipedia didn't exist. He could say practically anything, and medieval Europeans would simply nod and say, well, yes, of course, Mongols. He claimed, for instance, that Kublai Khan had a harem staffed with Golden Palace girls who were selected through rigorous beauty inspections. These inspections apparently included watching the girls walk, breathe, pour tea, serve wine, and quite possibly just exist in ways Marco considered educational. He described all this with a tone that's suspiciously familiar, like a travel blogger who's had one too many experiences at luxury resorts. But let's move gently through the details. Marco explained that the Khan's palace was arranged in layers: outer courts for servants, inner courts for officials, and then the inner courts, which were one part royal nursery, one part political battlefield, and one part do not enter unless you want to be highly executed. Inside these restricted chambers lived the imperial women, wives, concubines, secondary wives, tertiary wives, potential wives, temporary wives, women who might someday be wives if the astrologers said so, women whose job was to make the other women nervous by possibly becoming wives, and, naturally, the attendants who managed all of them with the weary exhaustion of nannies watching 40 toddlers fight over a single wooden toy. Marco described this with reverent calm. He had a talent for sounding impressed, even when he was, by his own admission, terrified. He noted that the harem women were carefully protected, not because the Mongols were romantics, but because succession in a vast empire could get complicated. Babies meant heirs, heirs meant politics, and politics meant that one ambitious servant with a romantic idea could single-handedly ruin dynastic stability. So the Mongols handled it with characteristic practicality. The women lived in separate quarters. The guards were eunuchs, men who had been surgically removed from the temptation equation, and the harem was operated like a carefully managed administrative unit, complete with ranks, duties, and daily schedules. Marco, for his part, pretended to understand all of it, but you can sense him blinking repeatedly while writing, because he had come from medieval Europe, where kings married one woman, kept several unofficial ones, and had no clue what anyone was doing in a political sense. The Mongol system, by comparison, was downright organized. Their spreadsheets, if they'd had them, would have been immaculate. Marco also spent an excessive amount of ink describing the selection of concubines. He explained that girls from noble families were often sent to the imperial court when they were around 12 or 13, because medieval childhood was tragically short and administratively efficient. These girls were then trained in palace arts, how to serve tea, how to sing softly enough not to annoy the Khan, how to walk without making noise, and how to look dramatically serene while doing absolutely nothing. He described the selection process like it was a cooking show judging round. The Khan would observe their poise, their manners, their willingness to take life advice from astrologers, and then choose several every year to join the inner palace. The rest returned home and were considered highly valuable marriage material, because once you had palace training, you could pour tea with such transcendent grace that aristocrats fought to marry you. Marco explained this all with calm fascination. He even mentioned, very gently, that the girls were divided into groups and rotated seasonally, like livestock, or possibly seasonal fruit. The Mongols were efficient, but they were not warm. And every time Marco wrote something objectively horrifying, he added a smooth detail like how beautifully the women dressed, or how peaceful the palace gardens were, because even Marco understood that his book needed to stay readable for the European public. No one wanted too much reality, certainly not while sitting next to a candle trying not to freeze in a damp Phoenician winter. One of Marco's strangest notes involved the concept of palace rest days. He claimed the Khan only visited certain groups of concubines on astrologically approved nights. Imagine a love life entirely dictated by a man holding a bronze compass and muttering about horse spirits. That was the imperial schedule. Marco, again, reported this calmly. He wrote that the women spent their days embroidering, discussing poetry, and participating in what he called exercises. He does not clarify these exercises, which gives us far too much room to imagine medieval stretching routines conducted by women who had absolutely no interest in cultural wellness trends. He also wrote quietly, almost apologetically, that the palace women traveled with the Khan when he moved seasonally. Not all of them, of course, just several hundred at a time. The rest stayed behind to guard the palace, as though the palace itself needed emotional support. Marco described the imperial caravans as enormous silken cities on wheels, complete with yurts decorated with gold thread embroidery. The harem women were transported in special carriages with thick curtains, because nothing in the harem was ever to be seen by the wrong pair of eyes. Marco, naturally, claimed he saw them anyway, through observation and curiosity, and the magical ability to be near places he absolutely should not have been. Medieval travelers had a certain confidence that modern airport security would, quite frankly, not allow. As we drift through his descriptions, it becomes clear that Marco didn't entirely understand what he was describing. He repeated rumors, he embellished, he filled in the gaps with the imagination of a man who'd never seen a palace larger than a Venetian mansion. And yet, hidden between the exaggerations, there are truths. The Mongol imperial harems were political centers. They were the homes of women who shaped succession, influenced appointments, and managed the domestic side of an empire spanning millions of square miles. Marco never grasped the full political sophistication, but he sensed it. He described the senior empresses with quiet awe. These were women known for their intelligence, their strategic marriages, their ability to navigate court conflicts without openly insulting anyone, which is basically Olympic-level diplomacy. These empresses managed household economics, supervised lower-ranking wives, and occasionally manipulated the entire government, all while maintaining a serene expression that suggested they had unslept more than 4 hours since their wedding day. Marco respected them. He also feared them, which is, historically speaking, the correct response. As we drift further into the night, let's touch lightly on one last detail. Marco includes one that medieval Europeans found particularly mesmerizing. He claimed the harem women performed dances, not scandalous ones, just soft, symbolic movements involving scarves and delicate hand gestures. These dances weren't meant for entertainment. They were ritual acts tied to Mongol beliefs, performed to honor ancestors, encourage good fortune, or simply mark seasons. Carlos from medieval France would have fainted from culture shock. But Marco wrote it all with a tone of yes, of course. This is very normal, even though you can almost hear him trying to stay calm while witnessing something far more refined than any Venetian festival he'd ever seen. And so, as we let Marco Polo slip quietly into the shadows of his own storytelling, we leave behind the silk-lined rooms, the veiled corridors, the overly enthusiastic astrologers, and the caravans full of women who probably did not appreciate Marco's observational habits. Let's drift onward, gently, into the next royal fiasco that history left for us like a breadcrumb trail of human absurdity. Hey everyone, let's settle back in. A slow inhale, a slower exhale, and let us drift gently away from Marco Polo tiptoeing through silk curtains he definitely was and tea supposed to be near. Tonight, we're turning to something softer, smaller, and historically much more fragile. Royal children, the ones who inherited crowns long before they inherited common sense, which, to be fair, many of them never did. It wasn't entirely their fault. If you grow up in a palace where everyone bows to you by the time you are I3, the odds of becoming a fully functional adult hover somewhere between unlikely and oh dear. So let's float into the quiet, candlelit nurseries of medieval and early modern Europe. Rooms filled with wooden toys painted with toxic pigments, nannies who were always exhausted, and tiny princes who had entire dynasties resting precariously on their very wobbly shoulders. We'll start gently with King Henry VI of England, because if ever there was a child absolutely unprepared to rule an entire kingdom, it was Henry. He became king at just 9 months old, an age when most babies are barely capable of locating their own feet, let alone running a government. In portraits, Henry always looks a little confused, a little startled, as if someone had just handed him the entire crown of England and no one had explained why. Which, to be fair, is exactly what happened. Henry grew into a man who preferred prayer over politics, meditation over meetings, and silence over literally any kind of responsibility. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't violent, he was, in the simplest terms, a gentle man placed in the least gentle role in the world. And naturally, because this is history, everyone around him made it worse. Powerful nobles fought behind his back, court factions formed like mold in a damp basement, and Henry responded by doing what any overwhelmed introvert would do when faced with national chaos. He quietly shut down. He experienced long periods of mental collapse, soft silences, blank stares moments, where he drifted so far inward that people wondered if he even knew he was king at all. Imagine the calmest meltdown in royal history. That was Henry. He would simply fade, like a candle running out of wax. And yet, people kept insisting he continue ruling because monarchy is, among many things, a system deeply committed to pretending everything is fine, even when everything is visibly on fire. Let's drift now to Charles II of Spain, a man whose entire existence was essentially a medical warning label for the dangers of dynastic inbreeding. Charles was born into the Habsburg family royalty renowned for their distinctive jawlines, which became more distinctive and less functional with every cousin marriage. Charles' jaw was so prominent that closing his mouth fully required what historians politely call effort. He struggled to chew, he struggled to speak, and he struggled to rule. though at this point you're probably sensing a theme. His tongue was too large for his mouth. His teeth didn't line up properly. One Habsburg relative claimed Charles drooled constantly, which is a remarkably blunt thing to say about a reigning king. Charles became king at age 3. Another child monarch thrust into a role requiring more political dexterity than his body and his dynasty could provide. He grew up terrified of storms, witches, illness, and the court factions who whispered that he was cursed. He wasn't cursed. He was simply the biological result of a family tree that resembled a wreath. Officials insisted he produce an heir. Unfortunately, Charles had the combined fertility of a stale loaf of bread. He tried twice. Neither marriage produced children. Court physicians responded by diagnosing him with everything except the actual cause. Centuries of genetic recycling. One doctor claimed Charles' body was filled with a mysterious coldness, which, in historical medical terms, meant we have no idea, but we needed to write something in the report. When Charles died at age 38, an autopsy was performed. The record claimed his body contained a single blackened lung, a heart the size of a walnut, no blood, and 3 pieces of hardened brain now. Obviously, medieval autopsy reports are not known for their accuracy. They are known, however, for drama. And Charles, in death as in life, apparently provided plenty. He died without an heir, because of course he did. And Europe immediately plunged into a war lasting more than a decade. All because a royal child who never should have been a king was handed a crown larger than his entire capacity for survival. Let's drift onward to France now, to Louis XIV's brother, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans. You might wonder why we're not talking about Louis himself, but Louis XIV was functional, powerful, the kind of man who looked at the sun and thought, yes, that should be my brand. Philippe, on the other hand, was raised to be exactly one thing, not a threat, a sibling deliberately softened, polished, and guided into harmlessness. The French court, being subtle as always, decided the best way to ensure this harmlessness was to surround young Philippe with lace, ribbons, dresses, and a strict prohibition against martial training. Essentially, they curated a childhood that ensured he would never lead an army or inspire soldiers, which, from the perspective of Louis XIV's advisors, was brilliant. From Philippe's perspective, it was confusing, and then irritating, and eventually a lifelong identity he wore with pride and a small amount of theatrical vengeance. Philippi grew into a man who adored fashion, collected jewels, and outdressed half the court combined. He was flamboyant before flamboyance had vocabulary. He also had a temper sharp, sudden, like a jeweled dagger. Being designed to be harmless tends to do that to a person, and yet, underneath the silk, the bows, and the endless parade of lovers, Felipe was competent, more competent, arguably, than Louis ever wanted him to be. He fought bravely in battle when he was finally allowed to. He managed estates like a pragmatic landlord, and he provided the French crown with descendants who shaped European politics long after Louis XIV's sun had set. But he was a royal child, molded more by fear than love, a boy raised to be decorative, not dangerous, which tends to produce adults who leave very interesting diaries. Let's float next into the chambers of Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. But tonight, we're not focusing on the terrifying part. We're looking at Ivan as a child, which is somewhat tragic, and very quiet, and incredibly lonely. Ivan's childhood was one long exercise in watching adults fall apart. His father died when Ivan was 3. His mother died when he was 8, likely poisoned by nobles who had grown bored of political subtlety. After that, young Ivan drifted through the Kremlin like a neglected ghost. He was surrounded by powerful families who used him as a prop, a symbol, a small human chess piece. He watched them fight, steal, shout, and occasionally beat the servants just to relieve stress. It was not exactly the soothing upbringing one associates with stable governance. Ivan learned early that cruelty was the language adults understood. He also learned that he could inflict it without consequence. So he did. He threw animals from towers. He humiliated servants. He discovered that fear was power. A child king in an environment with no affection and unlimited authority is, well, a recipe, and not the good kind. Not the kind involving onions, simmering pots, or happy peasants. This was a recipe for a future tyrant, prepared slowly and seasoned heavily with trauma. Ivan never stood a chance. He grew into the ruler history remembers, but But beneath every terrifying act was a frightened child, still wandering the corridors, looking for someone who wasn't afraid of him. Let's move softly, now, away from Russia's icy shadows, into the warm, scented courts of the Ottoman Empire, where young princes lived in what might be the most stressful childhood environment humanity has ever invented. Ottoman princes, from the moment they learned to walk, were raised to expect one thing: kill or be killed. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The Ottoman system of succession was designed to prevent civil war by ensuring only one son inherited the throne, and the traditional method of ensuring this was sibling reduction, a concept slightly less relaxing than it sounds. Young princes grew up knowing that if they became sultan, their brothers might not make it to lunchtime. They were raised by tutors who taught philosophy, poetry, languages, administration, and also how to maintain emotional distance from anyone who could someday end up strangled with a silk bowstring. This created a unique kind of royal childhood, one filled with art, education, gardens, and permanent psychological tension humming quietly underneath. Like background music no one could turn off. Some princes cracked under the pressure, others withdrew, still others grew into remarkable rulers, but all of them carried the shadows of that childhood. Every lesson, every whisper, every reminder that the person playing with them in the courtyard might not survive their success. It was, to put it gently, not the ideal environment for emotional development. So as we drift through these royal nurseries, English, Spanish, French, Russian, Ottoman, we start to see a quiet pattern. History is full of children who never should have worn crowns, children who were given power instead of affection, authority instead of safety, responsibility instead of rest. They grew up under chandeliers, surrounded by velvet and servants, yet many of them were lonelier than the poorest child in a village. And while their adult mistakes often scarred nations, the roots of those mistakes lie softly, quietly, in their childhoods, because royal children lived in palaces, but very few of them lived in peace. Hey everyone, let's settle in again. A slow breath, a softer exhale. You've made it back into the long, quiet hallway of this very sleepy historical wandering. In the last part, we drifted through the royal nurseries of the anxious, the traumatized, and the medically improbable. Tonight, we're moving gently from childhood chaos into the full-grown dysfunction of the royal households those children eventually tried duly unsuccessfully to manage. Because royalty isn't just about crowns, or thrones, or ill-advised portraits. It's also about the daily pettiness that somehow shapes nations. The jealousies, the fragile egos, the "I refused to sit next to him at dinner because he breathed wrong 6 months ago" level of diplomacy. So let's ease deeper into this dimly lit royal universe. Let's drift among courts where grown monarchs behaved like exhausted toddlers with access to armies. Because nothing helps people fall asleep like knowing that, historically, the world has always been run by mildly confused adults pretending everything is under control. We begin with a soft glide toward the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Now, you might think a man who named himself after a celestial object would radiate calm self-confidence, and he did on the surface. But underneath the golden wallpaper of Versailles was a court so petty it could have been the world's first reality show. Versailles was enormous, bright, and architecturally glorious. It was also full of nobles who had absolutely nothing to do all day except get dressed, gossip, bow at precisely the right angle, and panic if their lace wasn't symmetrical. Louis XIV designed this intentionally. He kept the nobles close, distracted, and dependent. If they weren't busy ruining the country, they were busy trying to earn the privilege of handing him his morning shirt. Yes, handing him his shirt. It was an official honor, awarded ceremonially. Nobles would fight for it, quietly and with enormous dignity, as only French aristocrats can. Louis loved this. It soothed him. It made him feel like the universe approved of his existence. Just imagine a man so powerful he can end wars, and also needs 4 people present to pass him a sleeve. The court revolved around these tiny rituals. They weren't traditions, they were psychological strategies disguised as fashion. And the nobles absorbed them because the alternative relevance was too terrifying to contemplate. But imagine living like that. Every day a performance, every glance a power struggle, every bow an accusation or apology. It was exhausting, for everyone, except Louis, who glowed serenely in the middle of all this dysfunction, like a well-lit chandelier. Let's drift softly north now, to the Danish court under Christian VII, a young king whose reign was equal parts tragic, chaotic, and oddly gentle in its disorder. Christian became king at 17, which is already a warning sign. 17-year-olds should not be allowed to manage anything more complicated than their own laundry, let alone a kingdom. Christian suffered from mental illness, likely schizophrenia, though historical diagnoses are always fuzzy. He heard voices, he experienced hallucinations, he developed obsessions, he giggled at funerals, he ran through palace corridors at night, he hit himself, he played practical jokes on ambassadors, which understandably caused diplomatic incidents. The court, naturally, handled this with grace and compassion. Just kidding. They panicked, they whispered, they plotted around him as though he were a chandelier, threatening to fall on their heads. Into this chaos entered Johann Friedrich Struensee, Christian's physician. Struensee was rational, calm, progressive, a man who believed in Enlightenment ideas and basic health care, deeply suspicious qualities for an 18th century court. He soothed the king's episodes. He encouraged healthy routines. He became the king's closest companion, and eventually, Struensee became the de facto ruler of Denmark. Christian, meanwhile, drifted gently through his own world, sometimes lucid, sometimes distant, while courtiers panicked over the fact that the king preferred juggling oranges to attending council meetings. Christian VII's reign became a quiet tragedy, a man unfit to rule, placed in a role he never asked for, and a court so focused on image that they forgot he was a human being. It's easy to laugh at the dysfunction. It's harder to sit with the loneliness behind it. Let's float now to Catherine de Medici's France, where petty dysfunction blossomed into a full-blown botanical garden. Catherine's court was a nest of noble families competing for influence, sometimes politely, sometimes with poison. She had 3 sons who became kings, not because they were competent, but because the French succession laws forced the issue. All 3 sons were fragile, sickly, and emotionally unstable. One was so nervous he fainted at loud noises. Another obsessively practiced archery in hallways. The third spent long hours staring at tapestries, as though hoping they would reveal a solution. Catherine tried to hold the country together. She organized alliances. She arranged marriages. She bribed, threatened, negotiated, and occasionally prayed in a tone suggesting she was speaking less to God and more to the ceiling out of sheer frustration. The French wars of religion raged around her. Protestants and Catholics fought endlessly. Catherine tried to keep her sons alive long enough for one of them just want to do something useful. None of them did. They were, in a word, decorative. And while Catherine's political maneuvering sometimes crossed into the deeply unethical, she also lived in a court where every meal risked poisoning and every council meeting risked someone flipping a table. It was not a restful environment, not even for a Medici. Let's drift further east, to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a place where royal dysfunction took on a uniquely democratic flavor. Poland elected its kings, which sounds refreshing, until you learn how the elections worked. Picture hundreds of nobles, each with an ego roughly the size of a large barn, gathering in a field. They shouted, they negotiated, they switched sides mid-sentence. Sometimes they brought armies, because nothing says healthy political process like pointing a cannon at your opponent to encourage them to vote correctly. Kings lived in constant fear of being unelected, not legally, just practically. If the nobles disliked you, they could sabotage your plans simply by refusing to attend meetings. The government would grind to a halt, and the king would sit alone in the palace like someone who forgot their own birthday party. One king, John II, Casimir, became so discouraged by the endless bickering that he abdicated and moved to France to become an abbot. He chose monastic peace over monarchy, which tells you everything. Polish kings often spent more time soothing noble tempers than governing. The Commonwealth was brilliant in theory. In practice, it was a sleep-deprived group project that lasted centuries. Now, let's drift into another royal household, the Spanish Bourbon court under Philip V. Philip suffered from severe depression, possibly bipolar disorder, but what truly shaped his court was his belief that clothing affected his health, which meant that sometimes the King of Spain refused to get dressed. Not partially, completely, entirely. Meetings were cancelled. Diplomats were told, yes, the king cannot receive you today. He is, unfortunately, naked and unwilling to compromise. Philip stayed in bed for days, convinced he was dying. His queen, Elizabeth Farnese, effectively ruled the country while also trying to negotiate with a husband who insisted he had turned into a frog. Yes, a frog. Philip also ate compulsively when stressed. At one point, he consumed enough hot chocolate to alarm his physicians. They attempted to reduce the intake. Philip responded by ordering more chocolate. Because if you're king, no one can actually stop you from making terrible dietary choices. The Spanish court learned to function around his episodes, but it was, undeniably, a dysfunctional household, a fragile king, a powerful queen, and courtiers who never quite knew which version of Philip would emerge each morning. And so, as we drift among these royal households, French, Danish, Spanish, Polish, we notice a recurring theme. Half the dysfunction came from the monarchs. The other half came from everyone desperately pretending the monarchs were fine. Palaces shimmered with gold, but beneath that gold lived anxiety, rivalry, and the quiet, unending fear that any small argument could spark a war. It's almost comforting, in a strange historical way, because it reminds us that power doesn't protect people from insecurity, or pettiness, or the universal human tendency to make things worse through ego, panic, or sheer confusion. These were the people who shaped continents, and they did so while behaving like anxious college roommates, over-caffeinated and under. Night had already settled upon Chengdu like a velvet curtain, thick and absolute, when Marco Polo wrote the next entry of his hidden notes. The scent of pine resin smoldering in distant braziers drifted through the palace corridors, mingling with the cool mountain air, and somewhere within the maze of courtyards and inner sanctums, a rumor was taking shape, something whispered only by those who dared to speak after dark. A place, a room, a chamber no man was ever permitted to enter. The Keraguzal, the eunuch overseer who had unexpectedly taken a strange liking to Marco, had come to him after sunset. His heavy robes rustled like dry leaves, and the stone lanterns cast shifting shadows across his face. "Marco," he murmured, "there is something you should see, something few have ever witnessed, but you must swear you saw it not as a man, but as a scholar." Marco agreed, though he felt the weight of the words settle like iron on his shoulders, and so the two walked into the deeper wings of the palace. The hallway of quiet steps, this section of the palace was unlike the bright, open courts Marco had previously visited. Here everything whispered. The torches burned lower. The walls felt closer. Even the footsteps of the guards seemed muted. Carved on the walls were scenes not of hunting or victory, but of dreams, women kneeling beside rivers, birds with 3 wings, flowers growing in spirals. The art was almost hypnotic. "The Khan keeps many treasures," Keraguzal said softly, "but none so strange as what lies ahead." A lacquered door of blackened cedar stood before them. It had no handles, no locks, only a carved sigil of the rising moon. The overseer pressed his thumb against the sigil, and somewhere deep inside, a mechanism clicked. The door opened without a sound. Inside the forbidden chamber, what Marco saw was nothing like he expected. There were no women here, no luxurious cushions, no perfumed curtains or jeweled incense burners. Instead, the chamber was filled with scrolls, thousands of them, some tied with silk ribbons, others sealed with wax, and a few encased in carved ivory cylinders. Each scroll bore a small wooden tag inscribed with neat calligraphy. Marco looked around in awe. "These," he breathed, "are records." Keraguzal nodded. "Every woman who has ever lived in the harem, their stories, their lineage, their dreams, and sometimes their secrets." Marco reached for one scroll carefully, reverently. It belonged to someone named Bulan, a dancer from the Western Mountains. The scroll described her not merely as a member of the harem, but as she who hears the wind speak and responds in song. Another scroll belonged to Hu Ying, a scholar chosen not for beauty, but for her skill with ink and poetry. It contained fragments of her dreams, meticulously recorded. Marco felt as though he had stumbled not into a chamber of royal indulgence, but into a living archive of souls. But then he noticed something else. A man, sitting cross-legged in the far corner, writing by the dim flame of a single oil lamp. He was elderly, his beard thin and silver, his robes simple and unstained. He didn't seem startled by their entrance. "You brought the foreigner," the old man said, his voice quiet but steady. "This is Marco," Keraguzal replied. "He has a mind that remembers." The old man nodded, then gestured for Marco to come closer. "The Scholar of Shadows, my name is Tengrabaz," he said. "I am the keeper of memories." Marco bowed with respect. But why record all of this? He asked. Why preserve these stories when no one sees them? Tengri Bors dipped his brush in ink and answered without looking up. The Khan believes beauty fades, power shifts, wealth scatters, but the stories of those who serve the empire must not vanish. Then he turned his gaze to Marco. Tell me, traveler from Venice, in your land, do you record the lives of women with such care? Marco hesitated. In truth, we do not. The scholar returned to his writing. Then learn this lesson, he whispered. Empires remember what they choose to honor. Marco let the words sink deep into him. A hidden danger. As they walked back toward Marco's quarters, Karagusel stopped him with a hand on his arm. You must not speak of this chamber, he said, to anyone. Marco nodded. I understand, but the overseer's expression tightened. Good, because there are others who would not be pleased you were allowed inside. Before Marco could ask who others referred to, the eunuch blew out his lantern, and the hallway plunged into darkness. Marco felt the sensation, something sharp, electric, of being watched, from the shadows, from behind the carved screens, from somewhere he could not see, and he understood that his presence in the harem was becoming more dangerous with each passing night. The next morning arrived, not with fanfare but with a quiet, unsettling calm. The palace grounds glowed faintly under a silver dawn, as if even the rising sun hesitated to disturb whatever secrets Marco had witnessed the night before. He slept poorly. Dreams drifted through his rest like wandering spirit scrolls, whispering. Shadows moving along silk curtains, the silent gaze of the old scholar Tengribos. But one sensation lingered longest. Someone had been following him. Marco rose, washed, dressed, and stepped into the corridor. A young attendant waited for him, silent, unreadable. The lady of the 7th garden requests your presence, the girl said, bowing slightly. Marco frowned. He had never heard the title before. Still, he followed. The 7th garden. The harem had many gardens, 6, Marco believed. But this new one, the 7th, was tucked away behind a screen of willow trees and a crescent-shaped archway carved with jade inlay. The garden was smaller than the others, enclosed, almost secret. Lotus ponds glimmered like pieces of polished moonstone. White cranes stood immobile, watching the water with the patience of stone statues. There, sitting alone beneath a pavilion of pale green silk, was a girl, no older than 15. Her posture was straight, her expression serene, but her eyes, dark as winter soil, held something Marco rarely saw inside palace walls: awareness. She studied him with the calm scrutiny of a scholar, not the shy curiosity of a harem girl. You're Marco Polo, she said softly. From Venice. Marco bowed his head. And you are? She folded her hands. I am Anka, she said. The girl who remembers. Marco raised a brow. Remembers what? Everything, she said simply. The living chronicle. She gestured for him to sit. In front of her lay a stack of thin wooden tablets, smoothed and sanded, their surfaces filled with so much writing it looked like rain etched in lines. Marco noticed something strange. Each tablet was written in a different script, some Mongolian, some Chinese, some Uyghur, others he didn't recognize at all. You write all of these? He asked. I record what I see, what I hear, what others forget. Marco paused. Why did you ask to see me? Anka tilted her head. Because you were taken to the forbidden chamber last night. Marco stiffened. How do you in? She placed a finger to her lips. In the harem, she whispered, every locked door has ears. Marco exhaled slowly. So you know what's kept there? The scrolls. Of course, she replied. I have read many of them, more than I should, more than anyone should. There was no pride in her voice, only fatigue. Marco leaned forward. And what do you do with all that knowledge? Anka gave a faint, almost sad smile. Nothing. That is my purpose, to remember, and remain silent. A warning in the morning light. A slight breeze drifted across the garden, sending ripples across the pond. Anka closed her eyes as if listening to something Marco could not hear. Finally, she spoke again. You are in danger, Marco. The words carried no drama, no fear, just certainty. Who? Marco asked. Who wants to harm me? Anka opened her eyes. There are two factions in the harem, she said. Those who believe knowledge should be preserved, and those who believe knowledge can destroy. And you? Marco asked. Where do you stand? She looked down at the tablets in her lap. I stand where I was placed. Between them, a crane cried suddenly, startling Marco. Its wings beat sharply, scattering droplets of water into the air. Anka continued. The more you learn, the more dangerous you become. You carry stories with you not on scrolls, but in your mind. That makes you unpredictable, uncontainable. Marco felt a chill. And what should I do? She leaned closer, her voice barely more than breath. Tonight, go nowhere unless you are summoned, and trust no invitation unless it comes from Karagusul himself. Then, in one smooth motion, she gathered her tablets and stood. The conversation was over. But before she walked away, she added something that troubled Marco far more than the warning. You are not the first foreigner to be welcomed into the harem's inner walls, but you may be the last. And with that, Anka disappeared behind a veil of willow branches, leaving Marco alone with the cranes and the weight of her words.